It is a multi-trillion dollar company today, but for most of its history, everyone thought it would go bankrupt. And that is Apple. And even after Steve Jobs came to Apple and they had hit successes like the iPod and even the iPhone, people still thought their products would be commoditized, just like much of the rest of the consumer electronics industry. TVs and digital cameras, you basically just pick based off of specs and price. You don't really care that much about the brand. And people thought Apple would go in the same vein. Now, when Warren Buffett invested in Apple, it wasn't until about 2018, 2019, when you could say that they had much more of a competitive advantage, these competitive moats. But if you waited until then, you also missed a good portion of the return. Now, there's nothing wrong with waiting until a business has a proven competitive advantage. In fact, I often do that myself, but just understand it's a different sort of investing, and you probably are going to miss some of the returns as a result. Now, the thing that value investors, and I put myself kind of in that group, usually miss is that there's a lot of businesses that could be attractive investments while they're building the moat. You don't necessarily have to wait until the moat is fully dug before you think that that could be a good opportunity. And again, this is a different way to invest. It could be a little riskier too as a result of the fact that you are buying something earlier in the process, but it also could come with more of a reward. And so back to this Apple example, in 2007, they launched the iPhone. People loved the iPhone, but at the same time, there's all these competitors popping up, a lot of other offerings that are going to be cheaper eventually too. And so the thinking at the time was that this would become a commodity product. Now, at some point though, and in my opinion, you could have seen that happen probably about 5-ish years after they had a couple iterations of the iPhone. And you notice that even with these other options out there, that people were still going back and buying the same iPhone. The retention rate of the iPhone was very, very high. And that is in part because of the software hardware integration provided a better experience, people's habits. There also was a bit of a brand that was pretty strong around Apple and the fact that this was kind of this higher end luxury product. And this is not me kind of just ex post facto saying this is what you could have seen. I did invest in Apple back in around 2013 for the first time. And that was because I noticed that a lot of analysts at the time did think that there was nothing special about this device, that people would very quickly move on to alternatives because they were cheaper. And that just, for me, was not my experience using it. I had no interest in ever getting an Android phone, and a few $100s cheaper was not going to change my mind about that. And I knew everyone I knew that had an iPhone felt the same way. And as we talked about in this video here, really important video, by the way, if you haven't checked it out, as long as you're retaining your customers, you can grow very slowly, and that growth is going to always add up to a lot, just because of the fact that you're compounding continually. And so that was kind of what I thought of Apple at the time. More and more people would try Apple and they would never want to switch back to Android. And that more or less has been happening. And so you could have seen that a little bit earlier on in the process than maybe 2018, 2019. And over time, though, their moats kind of grew to be even more. Once you had your contact list uploaded to the phone, it's pretty annoying to have to go somewhere else and upload it there. It also was becoming a thing that people didn't want that green text message. And it seems like a small thing, but it is definitely a real factor, especially if even amongst older people, but especially amongst younger people, that they don't want to text someone and get that green text. And so that was another sort of advantage, is that you only got the blue text if you were on the iPhone. And then there's also the app developer ecosystem and the fact that you had all your data on the phone. But then, the moats got stronger over time because the integration with your laptop, the integration with your other devices, your Apple Watches, then AirPods came out, and those worked very seamlessly on the iPhone. And the more devices you have, the bigger your Apple family is, the less likely you are to ever buy another device. And so that was another sort of competitive advantage that was being built. But that wasn't entirely apparent at that time in, the early 2010s. All that stuff was yet to come out, like the AirPods, the Apple Watch, and people liked their laptops, but they were nowhere near as popular as they are today. And so that was them in the process of building their moat. And so you could have identified some of those factors earlier on and saw the direction it was trending, and perhaps that could have given you enough comfort as an investor. But it's always tricky though when they're in the process of building the moats. And so you could look at Tesla in 2018 2018, and they have this cool idea for an EV car. EVs seem to be pretty popular. They have this model that seems very great, which is basically what Henry Ford did, which is focus on what people care about the most, which is getting the best quality car you can at the lowest price and meeting all these specs, not necessarily having all these different designs. And that's a mistake, perhaps, that a lot of other car makers make, is they dilute their production line with a lot of different variation. It adds a lot of complexity that drives up cost. It makes it harder to sell. And so originally they're like, we're going to have one car, the Model 3. That is what we're going to focus on. That is what we're going to scale. And there's only going to be, whatever it was, 5 colors, not a bunch of colors, not a lot of options. We're going to keep this as simple as possible to streamline production. Now, when they were making their EV cars, though, there's a lot of other things they had to build for the first time. ICE cars or internal combustion engine cars have this huge ecosystem of suppliers where they could outsource all sorts of production. So the car maker doesn't actually have to build a lot of different pieces of the car. They could just buy it for someone else. That didn't exist with Tesla. They had to build a lot of these things themselves. And so you could have noticed that if they were successful with that, that also would have been a huge competitive moat, because someone like GM would have to go out and build all this stuff themselves because there was no one they could buy it from. And they would have had kind of an edge up on them by then, because you have to start from a total fresh slate. So if you are an ICE manufacturer, you didn't have big competitive advantages of scale because you kind of had to start over. And so that was a competitive advantage that didn't exist yet, but you could have kind of noticed that if they were successful with this, that would be their edge. But the other side of that is it's much riskier. What if they failed? They were just weeks away from bankruptcy more than once. And so implicit in this idea of buying a business before the moats are built is this idea you were buying a riskier business. And so as a result, as an investor, you probably want to have more of these sorts of bets just in case a couple of them go bad. But if you want another way to sort of think about the math of how you could invest in these early stage companies when it's not just luck, but you could actually do some sort of analysis around what needs to happen in order to be successful investing in them, make sure you check out this video here, because that is critical to you not just gamble in them, but actually invest in them. So check out that video here if you haven't already seen it, because it will help you immensely in that regard. And if you're enjoying this information at all, go ahead and hit subscribe and like. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below.